If you haven't been around for the last couple of weeks, let me just kind of catch you up. You're at the tail end, the third week and final week of our family month. All right, we are talking about being strong families in a stormy world, and so far we have been talking about several things. We've been talking about how important it is for us just to make a decision and declare it that as believers and families that we will follow Christ, and then what we need to do to stay the course, and that is sometimes proceeding with caution, making sure we don't do a slow fade into the culture of the world. Last week we talked about how we can live in this tough environment of a world, somewhat of a modern-day Babylon in some ways, and how we can be, as opposed to being influenced by it, how we can be actually leaders in it, and how we can be influencers, and a couple characteristics of humility and wisdom and having the right identity that we need to be building in our children's lives and our grandchildren's lives so they can be leaders and influence. That brings us to today, right? And we have even asked you over the last couple of weeks, asked you the first week to do what we just gave everybody a paper stone. Still some out there. We just said, hey, put a family mission statement on there. Put a mantra. Put a favorite verse. It's really been amazing to see how many of you have responded and some of the great things. I know some of you, and that makes it even more exciting to see where your family is. This is something my wife put together for us after we decided what we wanted to put on it. There are still some of those done. Are still out there, and so you can pick up a blank one if you'd like to do that. Last week we challenged you as families to write your personal identity statement for you and your children, all right? Something that they could come back on that would be a rock that they could lean into as they make decisions, all right? So now we're at today, this final week. I was reminded the other day, my wife was out, just kind of out in the community, and she ran into one of our mothers, and here at the church. And in the conversation, the young mother worked for the VA, and she had, if I understood correctly, she had been given kind of the responsibility to begin to develop what was called basically a survivor bag for those people who worked for the VA, and it was literally a bag with some items in it that, in some type of a national crisis, those who worked for the VA would be able to get along for a little while. And as she said it, Steve, we have realized that there are so many people who lean on us that if we are not able to have what we need so we can continue to do our job, that there's going to be a lot of people who are not going to may not even be able to, have the money to pay bills and those kind of things. And I thought, that's amazing. And it got me thinking that sounds a lot like what we're talking about right now, and our role as parents and grandparents, as influencers in the lives of children. And so I made I got this phrase, I call it a SurThrival bag, all right? And so today what I want to do is I want to talk about, for just a few minutes with you all, I want to talk about what we need to be putting, what is our SurThrival bag. And this is going to be interesting because most of the time I don't say that the right way, SurThrival, all right? And so what is that SurThrival bag? What is that like? And what do we need to be putting in it? And what do we make sure that's not in it for our families to be ready as this world becomes increasingly more of a stormy world, more hostile to us as believers in Jesus Christ? Well, the bag, first of all, I would tell you is a bag, I would call it is a bag of hope. Now, hope is one of those words, like so many others right now, that we have to, if you say the word, there's all kinds of definitions flying out there. And I would just tell you maybe what you have heard before, maybe what you have not heard, all right, that hope for us as believers is not wishful thinking. It's not like, well, man, I hope they win. I sure hope that works out. That's wishful thinking and hope, and that's the farthest thing in the world from what true biblical hope is. Wishful thinking, hope is not visualizing something to the point where we kind of like make it happen. I mean, like we think just enough positive thoughts or visualize it happening, we can somehow believe that we gain a control over that, something that we can't gain control over. So it's neither wishful thinking nor is it some positive visualization. Instead, Biblical hope is this. It is a firm, practical belief in the character of God. A firm, practical belief in the character of God that actually bears fruit, that shows itself. It is so firm that it actually shows itself in our behavior. It shows itself in our decisions that we make. So, how are you doing in the area of true biblical hope? And how can we teach that? How can we teach that to our children? That's what we want to talk about for just a few minutes today. True biblical hope, it happens when we have our feet firmly on God's track record, when we have our hearts and our minds and are set on the promise that God has for us. It's when our eyes are set on heaven and we are making decisions based on those things. It's true biblical hope comes when we have in our bag the first of three things that are so important. Biblical hope comes out when we live our life, folks, with a wide-angle lens. A wide-angle lens. This wide-angle lens allows me, when I put it on the camera and look through it, it allows me not to see just what is immediately in front of me, but allows me to see to far to the left and what is immediately in front of me and far to the right. In some sense, in our lives, the past and the present and the future. And a lot of us carry cameras, and there's some amazing features in some of the cameras these days. It's called a panoptic view, and you can actually push the button, and depending on how new of a camera you have, you can take it and you can push a button, and you can almost walk in a full circle. And if you can walk pretty smoothly, you can actually get a picture of everything in front of you and everything in back of you. It's like a wide-angle lens on steroids. And when we're living with this wide-angle lens in our life, in this SurThrival bag of hope, guess what? We interpret the times not by what someone on the news tells us, but we interpret the time, and we help our children interpret the times by God's track record. It is why, and I say this a lot, but I just think it's so vital. It's why, folks, parents and grandparents, it's why us telling our stories, pre-faith and faith, coming to faith, it's why us telling those stories is so vital for our children. I was reading just the other day in Psalm 107, it says, "Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their stories." Let those God has redeemed tell their stories. Because our kids need to hear what's in the past and how God has been active in your life and in my life in the past. Without that, they don't have a frame of reference. It's why telling our kids the Old Testament stories is so vital, not just because they know the story of Daniel and Moses and David, but because they see flesh and blood men who were used by God, who had weaknesses and strengths, but they see God behind that picture. It's why when we look at Daniel, the third chapter of Daniel, and we've read a little bit about Daniel, and we read a little bit about his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And that classic story of when they basically refused to bow. And it says that Nebuchadnezzar's heart changed towards them. And he ends up throwing them in the fiery furnace. And it's just this amazing, amazing verse. I believe it's one of the most incredible verses in the Old Testament. It says this in 3:17. "If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. Even if he does not." Our children need to understand that God, deliverance to God looks a little bit sometimes different than it may to you and I. And sometimes we are delivered immediately out of the fire, and sometimes they're not. And it would be good to look at Hebrews 11 with our kids, to see so many of the early believers who lost their lives believing. Why were they able to take that stand? That's important. Why, as we are looking at more hostile times, as we're looking at a more stormy world, and we are able to look back, and it's important for us to know, why were they able to say, but even if he does not? Why could Hebrews 11 happen where people were tortured and sawed in two? What was it? Two things, very simply. One, they knew God was present with them. And if you read the story, you'll see that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not the only ones in the fiery furnace, but Nebuchadnezzar looked in, and there was yet another person there. Some believe it was actually Christ. Some believe it was actually just an angel sent by God. Either way, it was symbolic of God's absolute presence with them in the fire. And we need to teach our children that we can go through anything because God is present. And the other reason it makes very, very clear in Hebrews 11 is that they believed that God had promised them something much, much better. That was so much better they could go through anything in their present day lives. And a wide-angle lens, that panoptic view, allows us to see the past and have a courage for the present and live in the future and have courage because we have this promise for the future. You know, I was going through the other day, I was riding my bike and I saw this, just driving down York Street, and I love cemeteries, so I went into the cemetery. And I was just looking at gravestones, and it occurred to me, and I'm not sure if I would encourage you to do it this week of Halloween, but you know what? I think taking our kids, really, I think going to a cemetery and let our kids walk around and see some gravestones. There's an area that I go to just because I do a lot of services back in the back of Green Hill where they actually built a little place where they now do their services. And right in front of that, there's about 20 headstones. And I realize most of those headstones are headstones of children who have died, anywhere from infancy to 10 or 12 years old. I don't know if there's a smallpox epidemic that had gone through. And you know, cemeteries are a beautiful place to talk about life and death and the fact that life isn't nearly as long as we think it's going to be, and all kinds of things. And what is life going to be lived for, and what's after death? Take your kids to a cemetery. Maybe next week. Take your kids to a cemetery. Let them walk around. Let them look at some of the headstones and give yourself a chance to talk about life and death matters and the promise of the future. What happens? What happens if we don't live life with that wide-angle lens? Well, then we get myopic, don't we? If we don't live with that wide-angle panoptic view, all of a sudden we begin to get myopic, and our families get myopic, and then it leads to our children and that they have that myopia that allows them to see only what is in front of them. Have you ever met anyone who just can only focus, they interpret everything else that's going on, all the relationships, everything else, by what is immediately in front of them? It may be a divorce. It may be the loss of a job. It may be a child who is out there living the way they want to. And all of a sudden, all we can see is this. And if we don't have that panoptic view, that wide-angle lens, we begin to focus on this. The news would love us to interpret our lives and times by what is immediately in front of us. The whole ratings game for them is for them to create some type of myopia in our lives that results in us living in fear because this is happening. If you eat this is what will happen. This hurricane is coming. This storm is coming. This country is growing in strength. All things that create a myopia in our lives, and we begin not only to be fixed on it, focused on it, we begin to interpret our lives through it. And even more than that, our lives are filled, and the lives of our families are filled with a fear that paralyzes, a fear that takes away the ability for us to love and trust God and march on courageously into the next day. That's so important. And folks, sometimes we talk about faith, but we live with fear. And so we pass this baton that is a baton of faith, but it's like it's duct taped in fear. And our kids are trying to get like, okay, like I see you saying this is important, but I see you being anxious and worried and caught up in the day, and that's confusing to them. And the only thing that I know really, one of the things that can get us out of that is the second thing in our bag. I don't know if you can read this or not. I just picked it up. It says, give thanks. Give thanks. The first thing we need to do is make sure that we are living with a wide-angle lens. The second item that needs to be in our SurThrival bag is a heart of thanksgiving. I actually asked Carrie to see if she could find a cornucopia. Am I saying that right? She said, Steve, I don't think cornucopias exist anymore. I couldn't find a cornucopia anywhere. The idea is that our hearts are full of thanksgiving. Can you imagine? Can you imagine being in the ancient city of Thessalonica? And this is a city, the region that is going through tremendous persecution for those who are following Christ, those in the church. And the excitement's out one day because Brother Paul, we have a letter from Brother Paul, and Brother Paul has written us, and we all gather maybe kind of scared because we're gathering in a living room somewhere, and we don't want the government to know that we're meeting. And so someone gets out Paul's letter, and he begins to read it to all of us. And he talks about persecution. He talks about looking towards the second coming of Christ. That is our promise. And he ends this letter with, be thankful continually. Be thankful in all circumstances. And your child turns to you and says, Mommy, Daddy, we don't have food to eat. Our house was taken. You lost your job because of your faith. How do we be thankful? And we have to find a way, as they did, to explain to our children how we remain thankful, not for the circumstances, but in the circumstances. And there's a vast difference. There's a lot of things that happen to us or happen to those we love that we can't be thankful for. But we can teach our children to be thankful in them. Why? Because again, the same as in our panoptic view, because we know that in that, two things are true at least. That one, folks, our children need to know that God is present in that, even when it doesn't feel like it. God is present with us in that situation, and God is getting something done behind the scenes that we may not see or understand or get at the time, but He is at work. And if nothing else is happening, things are being developed in our heart and in our lives, faith and trust and love that probably would not happen if it was not for that difficulty, if it was not for that hard, that suffering at that time. Last year, I think it was during a family, I don't think that's symbolic. I hope hope still stands firm. All right, I don't know what to do with that, all right? Last year, as I was talking to my family, in my family series, I think it was last year that I had my dad come out and talk. And last month was my dad's 85th birthday. And when he slowed down, the last year has slowed down considerably. But his heart for Christ and people has not. It's been pretty amazing. And I called him on his 85th birthday, and this was so good that I just got out a pen as he was speaking, and I wrote this down. I thought, that's just what my life needs to be about more. My dad is, as most in that age, has really lost a large amount of his hearing, and so this guy who's such a social cat and loves to be in the center of people and conversation is often lost because he can't hear what's going on, and I mean, all those frustrations and insecurities, I know it come from that, and he's always been active, and, his body's just beginning to, show the wear and tear, his knee replacements and some of those things. And this is what he said: Steve, I woke up this morning with a whole list of things to be thankful for. The older I get, the more I realize that's really what it's all about. I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. that we live with a wide-angle lens in our bag of hope. And second, that we make sure that we have a heart full of thanksgiving in our lives. Those things are vital. What else? I think it's also important. That we make sure that we are not running. That we are not running from this. Let me see if I can grab this, right? That instead that we find our daring role. All right? Now, this is my daring role. Can you see it? It's a role. That's supposed to be relatively funny, okay? But it's all I could come up with, okay? All right? It's my daring role, okay? Yes, I do know that the spelling is different. Just checking, English teacher, okay? All right? It's important for us to find our daring role. Because you know what? Part of the reason that I have to believe that your kids and some of my children have at some point in time questioned their faith or even abandoned the faith in some way is because, quite honestly, it can be pretty boring if it is not done correctly. And when it comes down to a bag of moral code and rules and regulations and just making sure you're checked in at the right place at the right time, doing the right thing every time, there's a whole lot out there that is more interesting to them. But when we help our children look around and see what is going on to them, and they interpret in the light of Scripture, and they interpret in light of that God is present, and they know that He is with them, and that they have an actual role in that world where they can make an impact, where they can make a difference, not by having a cape around it, but by just taking what God has placed in their lives, folks. I think less kids would be inclined to leave the faith if we made their faith thing the way it was supposed to be. Now, I'm not talking about always getting them thrown in a fiery furnace, but there's a lot of fiery furnaces out there these days. And if we can help our kids understand, man, hey, listen, life is an adventure. Life is an adventure. Some of the biggest adventures in my life, my Christian life, were in high school, where I was surrounded by some friends who were good friends, but were barely believers, and some of them were just pagans. And the idea of trying to live amidst that and look for opportunities to share Christ with them. I just spent 2 days at a cabin out in Missouri for the last 2 days with a couple of these guys that I had a chance to share Christ with when I was in high school. And I remember laying in bed and being scared to death about what their response was going to be if I mentioned the name of Jesus to them and tried to share what He was doing in my life. And that made life daring. That brought an adventure to life. And that's a little scary as parents. It's easier just to bring them into our little fold and be safe and make sure that all the little friends are little Christian friends. But that's not the role God had in mind for them. Don't forget, folks, that although this hostile environment is largely because of our disobedience, God still uses it in amazing ways. And the fact that it is growing a hotter environment for us as Christians, folks, only means, and the fact that it is a tougher environment for everybody, that is harder for families to survive, it's hard for individuals to survive, only means that there are more spiritually hungry and thirsty people out there living next to you, working next to you, sitting in English class next to your child. And we have been placed there, as Esther was, with the idea of you're here for a purpose. And that makes life so much more exciting, so much more purposeful when we can teach our children, hey, why are you, I know these people are frustrating around you. I know that coach frustrates you, but why are you there, and what can we do to impact our world for Christ? A couple weeks ago, this summer, I went to a CIY conference, and I served as a conference pastor there. It just happened this particular conference. My son, who works for CIY, leads this conference, and also happens that his wife and his children go. And this year they were, on top of everything else, they were raising some money so they could do an international conference in the country of Ireland. And so I was sitting at the back towards the end of the week, and they're raising this money, and they basically, Lane says, kids, if you want to raise money for CIY to go to Ireland, here, come and take one of these coupons. And he said, then when you get your $200 that you raise, you give this into a coupon, bring it back to CIY, and you can have kind of a part in it all. It's this ownership. What a great challenge. And my 6-year-old grandson, Ledger, sits next to me and he goes, Pops, I want to do that. And I was like, oh, yes, I kind of thought that's kind of cute. I said, well, Ledge, I'll tell you what. He said, would you help us raise money if I do that? And I said, let's wait till we get back to Uma's house. And I said, we'll, at the end of the week, and we'll talk about how we can help you raise it. About 30 seconds goes by, and he looks at me and goes, Pops, I want to do that now. And I said, well, it's like, okay, well, that's cool. I said, but you be patient. About 30 seconds goes by. This is no kidding. He says, Pops, I want to do a lemonade stand. It's like, okay, when we get back to Uma's house, you're this pattern. We'll talk to Uma and we'll get you some lemonade and we'll make. Pops, I want to do a lemonade stand now. Then he looks right at me and he says, Pops, we got all these kids on this campus. And they're walking across the campus, and it's really hot, and they're going to get really thirsty. Entrepreneur stuff going on in this kid's mind. He said, we could make a lot of money selling lemonade. I said, well, you're going to have to take that up with your mom. And here's the parent thing. He talks to his mom. His mom had a long week on the middle of a campus, doesn't really know hardly anybody, just got these 3 little old dudes around at her side, running around after my son, trying to keep up. I don't know what she did, but within 24 hours, she had commandeered, ice coolers and lemonade, and she had 20 gallons or something of lemonade. So the next day, we come out and we set up the Lucky Lemonade stand. And as the kids are coming across, it's about 103 out in Texas, and the kids are walking across campus, and they see the lemonade stand, and they head for the lemonade stand. And they're, it's $1 a cup, and then they realize, the sponsors and the coaches start realizing what this is for, She's got all the boys yelling, Lucky Lemonade, raise money for Ireland, And so they start throwing in 5s and 10s for this lemonade. That afternoon, Lane finds out about this whole thing, and he has the boys come forward in front of 1,000 young people, high schoolers, and says, I understand you guys raised some money. Said, we did, Dad. And he said, so how much did you raise? Puts the mic to Ledger's mouth and he says, we raised $500. In 45 minutes, they raised $500. But living that night, here's the cool thing. One, he saw something touched my 7-year-old son, 6-year-old grandson's heart. He wanted to raise money for Ireland. He knew that CIY brings young people to Christ. He wanted to be a part of that gig. And Kelly could have shut it whole down and said, oh, Ledge, we just don't have the time. Mom's tired. Those excuses we do. And instead, she saw an opportunity to bring about daring faith in the heart of her children. So she did what she needed to do and stayed up a few extra hours and made some phone calls to make it happen. And that's something that those kids will probably never, ever forget. Daring faith. What do we have in our bag of hope? Do we have a wide-angle panoptic lens? Do we have a heart full of thanksgiving, and we're looking for opportunities to teach our children that, so we don't become caught up in conflict, so we don't become discontent, so we don't become one of those people who just complains about everything? And are we building in our children a daring faith, or is their world just getting smaller and smaller because we're trying to keep them safe? Now, folks, God is going to use us and our children to make a difference in this community, because there are hopeless families out there. There are hopeless single moms and single dads. There are people who amongst us and out there who have lost a spouse, who are lost a child. There are people who so need this hope, this SurThrival bag and what is in it that we can have with us if we will see the importance of it and the importance of passing those things on to children. This is a community who simply needs what we have. The husband of the wife that my wife talked to the other day said, Steve, look at our community. Look at the poverty. Look at the educational problems we are having. Look at all these things that we're struggling with. What's the answer, he said. The answer is Jesus. And it's Jesus living in that bag of hope that we have and coming out as we look at the world through this wide-angle lens, as we live with a heart of thanksgiving, as we create in our lives and the lives of our kids this daring faith. And I know in this very room there's hopelessness. Or what feels like it. I know there are marriages that are hanging on by a thread. I know that some of us have kids who are so far away from the Lord. And it so breaks our hearts. And we so feel hopeless sometimes. And we have a number of us who have lost jobs. And we're in situations where we've lost a spouse to death. And we're living that a life of hopeless aloneness sometimes. And I encourage you to take hope. Take hope in Christ. Not only for you, but you can be a light in a dark place. Let's stand and sing together.